All right, everybody, welcome back to Drug Dealing. So today we have a very interesting topic for you. Today we talk about debunking the myth around cures in biotech. So what are cures? How come there aren't more cures being pursued by biotech companies? Is it is it that biotech companies and pharma companies don't pursue cures because it's financially less beneficial to them? So we're going to unpack all that and all the different implications that come out of it. But maybe Kenny, I'll kick it to you to tee up the cures topic for us.
Yeah, so I've heard this a lot. I've heard this from people who perhaps are not as connected to the space or are curious and have this comment where, why doesn't the industry cure more things? Oh, is it because they want this recurring revenue, razor blade model where if they cure it, they know they won't get the income, they won't get the revenue and profit generation. So they'd rather continue to treat the ailment with medicines that go on indefinitely. And Shivu, this is something I've heard over the years from many different voices. And I think that's why it's important to address. One bottom line takeaway is I wish our industry had that scientific mastery. And I think you and I can get into the details now.
Yeah. So maybe we could start with like why this belief even exists. Why do people believe that biotech and pharma companies just avoid curing diseases?
Yeah, I think some of it is general frustration with the industry. I think there's cost concerns if I'm a patient, which I am, and I've had several medicines that have been expensive over the years, maybe some that didn't work as well. And sometimes you go to the doctor saying, why do I have to keep coming back to you? Why can't we just resolve this? It takes so much of my time and day. And by the way, this medicine isn't perfect. I have other issues with it. Why are we not able to knock this out? And because the industry, I think, is not well understood, Shivu, I think the technicals throw people and they just assume, oh, they would rather do this than really help me. And so that's why I think this misperception has existed. And, we've talked about public distrust. There are drug pricing conversations and controversies. Insulin comes up a lot from a major senator out in the East Coast. And there's also been some thinking that, oh, but if I have this disease and it goes on forever, they will make so much more money. I'm an economic unit of profit to them. And so there's been some narratives that, treatment is more profitable than a cure. And unfortunately, this is not related to just biotech. Trust in the corporate world has eroded quite considerably. So I hope I'm covering the bases.
Yeah, for sure. I think I think we'll get into this in a bit more detail in a little bit, but both of us from our lived experience have never felt that corporate intention of, hey, we can't cure this disease because it's more profitable for us to keep people sick and just make something into like a chronic illness. We never felt that. And I do think what goes on inside of a biotech company is so opaque for the average person, which is a big reason, why you and I started this podcast. And hopefully through the course of this discussion and future episodes, it'll become a little bit more clear for people. But I do think like just corporately, we don't need to name names, but there's certainly companies in our sector that don't do themselves any favors about, their like putting profit above, other things, right? I don't think deep down that's in the DNA of any company in our sector, but clearly there are like corporate behaviors some companies in the sectors do that don't help the narrative, that actually kind of do support the, you can interpret it in one way to support the narrative that, oh, these drug companies, they're just out to make money and they're not here to help people. Of course, they would want to keep us sick and, make sure that, cures are available to us, which is why, like in the midst of COVID, all the stuff about these alternative treatments and, ivermectin and all this other stuff like gets a lot of steam is because of things like this, right? People don't trust that the, individuals at these companies are in it for the right reasons and pushing forward science that is guided at helping people, treat disease, but are just focused on making money. So, I think maybe we get into it now, and unless you have something else to add to
No,
that.
No, I think that's right on. I think one thing you said about COVID, I think is interesting, Shiva. Do you remember it was, early 2020, we started to deal with it. I was actually at work on Friday. It was March 13th where I was told to go home. And if you remember, the vaccines came out later that year, same year. And the typical vaccine development plan, if I'm not mistaken, is 5 to 7 years. And in 8 months, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna had churned out their initial blueprint for what they think should happen. And the government forced all manufacturers to pivot to that and make it. And I think that also might contribute to some of the concern. Wait a minute, if they can do all this stuff so quickly, why hasn't it happened before? But what's important for folks that are listening, or maybe who are not in the industry, to keep in mind is when the world stops and the government gets behind treatments, it's a very different game. And that's something where we all saw. Otherwise, it is 5 to 7 years. It costs a lot of money. Another thing I'll share is the government was sending funding support overnight. They were wiring $200 million to companies, things like that, to get going. So that's something I feel is not perhaps as well understood because you mentioned COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that was a very special case, like a worldwide pandemic where the United States, especially as, the leader in that space for the world, needed to mobilize very quickly to get, some kind of therapeutics or vaccines available, uh, so that they could, eventually get to people and somewhat blunt kind of the course of COVID, whether that was like successful totally, or, maybe there's certain phases where it was successful, et cetera, is a different debate. But that I think was a very special case for sure. So let's talk. Is there any evidence we should talk about? Is there any evidence that, companies are making this trade-off where they're going, nah, screw it, I'm not going to cure this disease. Let's keep these people sick. Let's keep the money machine printing.
It's a good question. I think that's got to be number one. No, haven't. So I can tell you from my experiences and having read so many publications and the development plans for other medicines that have been approved, Shiva, I haven't seen any evidence of that. I think many companies wish they understood the disease that well, that I can actually knock out this entire process with this medicine. Unfortunately, the truth is we're just at the cursory level of many diseases. And the idea of a cure is so far away, most companies don't even use the 4-letter word. So I do not see any evidence in that. And you and I have some case examples from our own work and maybe some observations of our time in the industry where that's unfortunately just not something we've seen and can corroborate with the perception.
Yeah. And I think too, the system itself is not necessarily aligned towards cures. And like even in the scientific process, right? Like cures are very hard to come by because it takes a very deep understanding of the biology of a particular disease, as well as the underlying, technological capabilities of developing the right type of drug to fix that specific disease. Can be very expensive. And sometimes those tools haven't come about until recently, right? Like with the advent of gene and cell therapies, for instance, that opens up a larger aperture of diseases that are potentially curable. But you also need to layer in that fundamental understanding of how that disease works. And, there's great examples of diseases where I think the tipping point, right, for a lot of these cures is, okay, we get exactly how to stop this thing. Now we can develop a cure for it. So all the stuff, in virology, for instance, is I think conceptually like a little more curable than something that's a chronic disease or something that's like living in the human body, right? One of my old colleagues used to say, virology is easy. It's see the bug, kill the bug, right? But, obviously every bug is different, right? HIV is completely different beast than HCV, is different beast than the flu and COVID, et cetera. But, conceptually, there is something foreign that has invaded your body, taken host of your different parts of your body. And, your body is generally pretty good at finding foreign things and killing them. And, the drugs guided at doing that are there to kind of support that endeavor, right? But there's plenty of diseases that we've sunk a bunch of money into that where we just either don't have a really great understanding, or we do, it's just really hard to cure, right? So something like Alzheimer's, which you and I have talked about before, seems like it could be 5 or 6 different diseases, right? We have a whole framework problem about how we understand those diseases. There's, a relationship to gingivitis in your mouth with Alzheimer's, right? There's like a toxin component to Alzheimer's. There's clearly like a cardiovascular metabolic component to it. So, I mean, there's so much money we've sunk into that disease, and now we have like drugs approved that are disease modifying, but they don't really work all that well. But maybe that's a situation where we have 5 or 6 different types of diseases all rolled into one, which is to say, even though we've spent a lot of money as an industry on that, we don't have a great understanding of how that disease fully works, which is a big barrier to potentially curing that disease, right? Stuff like cancer, for instance, I think we've sunk a lot of money into it. I think we have like just being a oncology guy for most of my life, I think we have a really great understanding of how cancers work. It's just a moving target, right? That thing adapts to the drugs that you give it. It evolves. Cancer you could think of as one way of a disease of hyperevolution, right? You're cycling through, multiple rounds of cell turnover. Cells are expanding very quickly. It's going through evolution very quickly, right? The cancer in your own body. So it's able to adapt quickly to different drugs that you throw out, different therapeutic strategies you throw out. So it's a constantly moving target. But there are some cancers that we've done a really good job curing. And now that we have, I guess, simpler cancers, right? Like B-cell driven leukemias and lymphomas, we have very curative therapies for those now where people don't need to suffer. You can get a one-time treatment and, be cured for the rest of your life, potentially. I don't know, anything to add to that?
You said something very interesting about when you are dealing with a virus and trying to cure it, you can find the bug, cure the bug. And I think that's something that's perhaps not also as well understood. You mentioned the hyperevolution and the moving target in oncology, which makes it so difficult. We nail down one pathway, we stop the tumor from growing, we cut off its food source, but then it mutates because it evolves so quickly. It finds another way to grow and persist. And maybe some of those pathways it uses are what healthy cells use. And then it makes it even more difficult. It's a very sinister therapeutic area, unfortunately, when you look at it. One thing I'll share on the virus comment you made, I think one good way to think about it is you have this virus causing what I would say virologic insult. It's causing some kind of issue in the body. And it's only it doesn't have a continuous driver. So if you resolve the virus, it's done. What's different about some of the more common diseases that are chronic today are maybe metabolically driven, as an example, because people know about GLP-1s. Well, the metabolic insult is somewhat driven by your energy intake, and there's no judgment on that. But the truth is, if the energy intake is out of balance relative to your needs, that will form an insult where your sugars are a little higher, your fatty deposits increase, maybe your liver is struggling to keep up, your pancreas is struggling to produce the right amount of insulin. All these things continue. So that insult pathway, what's called metabolic insult, Shivu, the cure for that can't be the same as some of the other indications because the driver of the insult is continuous and maybe in some people is increasing. So when you use the word cure, let me define that real quick. I want to look up the old school Webster's, right? A medical cure is a substance or a procedure that completely eliminates a disease or medical condition, restoring the patient to full health without the expectation of a recurrence. And another way to think about it is it involves the permanent end of a specific instance of the disease. So there are some diseases, like I told you, virology is a great example, perhaps cancer is one, because that may not always be correlated to your lifestyle, where once you are able to eliminate it, you mentioned some blood cancers, that is it. And hopefully that remission persists. But then there are some indications where a cure really isn't on the table, just because of the lifestyle and the environment that we live in.
Exactly. Yeah. No, and I think one other aspect maybe to add to that is if it was purely financially driven by these companies, cures wouldn't exist at all, right? We do have great curative therapy. We talked about Hep C, which, we could double click into that example, but, CAR T therapies for B-cell malignancies are curative. Zolgensma, right, from Novartis for a gene therapy for SMA, curative potentially, right? So these therapies wouldn't exist if companies were strictly just thinking about their finances, right? And oftentimes too, we don't live in a healthcare system where, I want this thing, I just pay for it and get it, right? Because they're very expensive drugs. And, now pretty much nobody, very few people have, the $2.1 million or whatever it takes to, buy a cure and get it, right? So that's another thing. These cures are often, just given where medicine is going, especially for more complex diseases, and rare diseases, oncology, and that type of stuff, the cost of these therapies, both to develop them, produce them, and are very high, right? They're hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it's a big financial bite that somebody is paying for. Theoretically, it's like your insurer who's paying for it. And a lot of insurers, there's a big battle, right? A lot of insurers don't want to pay the $400,000 it takes to pay for a CAR T therapy that could potentially be curative for a patient, right? It's a big cash flow thing, right? That it's $400,000 one time. A lot of times that insurance company might lose that patient and not be able to recoup that quote unquote investment in that patient, right? So it's the point I bring up is that like there are systemic barriers to cures, but despite that, companies still push forward and put cures out there, right? It's easier to get a drug reimbursed that's a pill that you just take once a day for the rest of your life, but something that's curative that, costs a lot of money is harder to get insured.
It's a good point that what if we want to create a cure and it's expensive, but it's a one-time thing and it's done? You're right, Shivu. The system is not built for that.
Yeah.
Insurance companies were struggling to cover a drug that was developed by Spark Therapeutics. I believe it was a gene therapy that addresses some vision loss and actually resolves potential blindness in this patient population. And it was priced below $1 million. And I remember the commentary was, how are insurance companies going to pay this? How are patients going to pay for this? And why in the world is something like that priced so high? And when you restore one of the core 5 senses of the human body, let's go the other way. When you don't have it, Shivu, the fall risk, the lifetime of a person who doesn't have vision is so difficult and is so challenging to execute your daily tasks. Unfortunately, their fall risk is exponentially higher than yours and mine or people with standard vision. And so when you remove all those things, there is an analysis done on the value to the healthcare system. And insurance companies understand this. They have their own processes to do the math as well. But initially, the concern was, how are we going to cover it? They knew the long-term value was there, that it's actually a net long-term value in the tail of the life of that patient. We're not counting how much better it is for them. We're just looking at the economic cost to the insurance company and the healthcare system. They know it's more valuable and that the payment up front makes sense. The problem is the budget is not structured for that. The budget is structured for a continuous stream. So as Spark Therapeutics and others have tried to create cures, sometimes they get pushback because the initial cost versus a curative. So again, it's easy to understand why some people think that this is what the industry wants, but the truth is, despite all those barriers, they'll still do it.
Yeah, despite all these barriers, people will still do it. I think this is maybe a good point to jump into the HCV example if you want to double click into that, because it kind of starts to touch on some of these. Why are these so expensive? How do you pay for these? And there was a lot of innovation on kind of interesting payment models that people threw out there. So you want to double click on the HCV example? I know you lived and breathed it while we were at Gilead.
Let's do that. So hepatitis C, going back to the basics for some folks, viral infection. This is a viral infection caused by the hepatitis C virus. That's where we get HCV. It primarily affects the liver. It does lead to inflammation and potential long-term damage. Now, we started to get cures a few years after 2010 or so. Until then, about 70 million people in the world who had hepatitis C. And what I think is interesting is because a lot of people who are aware of the space, they may not have connections to HCV. It was a very unique patient population. But I think what is most important to know is that disease was the number one cause of liver transplant until cures entered the space. And so it's that bad a disease. Now imagine liver transplant, you have the huge scar, your organ comes out, you get a donor's organ, you're on lifetime immunosuppressants. It's a very hard life. Certainly it's better than death. So that's how serious the disease is. So Gilead and other companies were in the space for a while. They had some
Just to say, it's a very just to underline it for people, like, that is like you are at end stage liver failure and you need to get your liver cut out and get a new one put in from a donors who are, not just growing on trees, right? It's very hard to find a donor liver. That's why there's this, list that you have to get on. That's why there's all these stories about, rich people bumping themselves up to on these donor lists, etc. I mean, there's also a lot of risk with liver cancer as well, right? HCV can cause the liver cancer, which again is, obviously lethal, but also might require you to get a liver transplant.
That's correct. Maybe this is something that's worth mentioning. Again, we don't evaluate the dollars in terms of human life. We do our best to preserve it. But to the healthcare system, there is a cost to liver transplant. And I was looking at some estimates. There's some estimates from 2020 that go as high as 880,000 for a liver transplant. Some estimates past 1.1 million. That pricing obviously changes outside the US, but you get a feel for how serious the disease is. And that's not the end. That's just the transplant. Then you have lifetime immunosuppressives, probably a lot of visits to your hepatologist, your liver doctor, and other aspects of the healthcare system because your liver is so intrinsically important to everything in your holistic health. So that is HCV and how severe it is as the disease progresses. So Gilead and others were in the space. I won't bore the audience with the full history of it, but they use some blunt instruments that cause other issues to try to suppress the disease, not cure it. Gilead was the first to come in. They acquired a company. They were the first to come in and try to do a cure in HCV. And because there was such a large such a large need of patients who were going to use it, Gilead raced to incredible revenue in such a short time. In 2014, they generated $12 billion in sales. Their peak was 2015 at over $19 billion in sales. And when you look at it, it's tapered off over time. They've generated over $75 billion in the cumulative effect of all HCV sales. Now, I'm giving you the high-level story. Let's dig into some of the details of the cure and how things happen. So once they realized it could cure, they tried to hit all the patients because there are different subsets of HCV called genotypes 1 through 6. The initial drugs didn't cure all of them. It cured some of the more major subsets of patients. And it went from that to, so what I'm trying to tell you is once they cure one, it was how do we cure the next one? How do we cure the next? Wait a minute, how can we cure all of them? It kept growing. There was never a conversation at Gilead. How do we slow it down? How do we stretch it out? It was always faster, safer, better. That was the constant evolution and pushing the scientific team and pushing the clinical team to find these patients and test the drugs, make sure this is the right way. So as we progressed in the space, 2014, 15, 16, and beyond, we would see that, the patient population was shrinking. And while that's unfortunate for the company as a business, it is very fortunate for society and for the world and for those people. And so what happened as things progressed, other companies started coming in. And so what we had was a company by the name of AbbVie came in and they wanted to take their own approach in HCV. And so the cures from Gilead took about 12 weeks. They're very safe drugs. You could be at almost end stage liver failure and take those medicines and be safe with them. But AbbVie came in and said, we think we can do it in 8. So AbbVie came in and even turbocharged everything Gilead was doing. And when they came in with more aggressive pricing too. Because to some physicians, that drug was not the same. It was a little different, and it wasn't as safe in some of the sicker patients. Gilead had an advantage there. But to some physicians, Shivu, and many who are listening will know, some doctors think less medicine is good medicine with a similar outcome. So to go from 12 weeks to 8, because there are other considerations as well with testing the patient and all that, it was very desirable. And so what happened was not only was Gilead trying to cannibalize its own sales by going faster and finding more patients and getting out there and then launching globally, you had competitors come in and say, we want to beat you to the punch. And so there was this downward spiral of how many patients are left and how do we handle this? But it was ultimately the right and best thing to do. And now HCV is not even much of a meaningful driver over time. This will take time of liver transplant and liver health. So I'll pause there.
I think just for the folks listening, remember this was a big outcry, negative outcry against Gilead when they came out with this cure, right? They were charging $1,000 a pill. One pill is right, 1 pill a day for 12 weeks, and you're curative, your HCV. The potential costs, as you said, for a patient, right, could be in the millions. Depending on A, do they die? B, do they make it to liver transplant? Is it successful? Are they taking their meds correctly and taking these immunosuppressants and all that? I mean, so if you just think about it, like people put up, a really big fuss. And I think because of the sticker shock of $1,000 for a pill, like that doesn't make sense. I can get Tylenol from CVS for I can get a 90 pack at Costco for $3 or something like that. How does that make sense, right? But how drugs are priced, like it takes into account the savings that, the healthcare system feels and experiences because a disease is no longer existing, right? Like there's a world within our lifetime where hepatitis C will not be an issue at all. It just won't exist in the
Yeah.
world. And that is crazy. That is a crazy, crazy thing, right? Like this, we deleted this disease from the planet, from our species.
It was an amazing effort, and you're right. There will be people who grow up nowadays who don't know the disease. That is an amazing feat. And so what also we didn't talk about, and I don't even have the details for it, typically to get a drug approved, 700 million to $1 billion. In some diseases, it's 1.5 billion. I'm not saying Gilead priced it wrong or right. What I'm saying is it wasn't a simple thing. And the cost of
Well, they had to
manufacturing,
acquire a company to get it, right? Pharmaset was, how much was it? 10
11.
billion? 11 billion. So they acquired a company for $11 billion for this drug, largely for this drug that they had deep conviction about, that they thought would cure HCV, right? There's a bunch of other companies who acquired, related competitor companies where, the drugs didn't work out, right? Like Merck acquired somebody,
Correct.
yeah, and that drug kind of just, didn't end up working, right? And so that's like cost to it too, right? Like why as a company am I gonna, go spend $11 billion for, this drug that is gonna create this market where it's this short time frame where I can make any. I'm losing my market every time I cure a patient, right? That patient never comes back. So even just like logically, for if you were just strictly thinking about this financially, it doesn't make any sense. Yet still people do it, right? And it's just a magical thing. I mean, like every company desires to cure something because it is just so meaningful to the patients who are suffering from these diseases, right? And I think everybody that we've interacted with too, like really feels that. Like it is a disservice if we do not, you know, advance the science in the best way possible for patients.
Yeah, I think it's right. And so the biggest story there is when we present and share these data and other companies come in and look at it, they say, we think there's a better way to do it. So you have the whole industry. It's not just one or two players. You have the whole industry. And then you have doctors asking questions too, like, why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? And then researchers. So it became one of those things where Gilead did the right thing. Other companies came in, they did the right thing. They challenged Gilead on your thinking. Maybe it doesn't take 12 weeks. That was something Gilead, I'm sure, took as a lesson for the future. And so it was an amazing part. It was an amazing thing to be a part of. And to know that we're helping people live longer, live better. They won't even think about HCV at a certain point.
Yeah, I think the really interesting aspect about the HCV example was how high the cure rates are, right? I mean, just me coming from the oncology world, like there's therapies out there that are, you get a 50% chance at actually being cured. And we're like, wow, that is, that's really phenomenal, right? This HCV example was like 99.9% of people, right, who get, one pill once a day for 12 weeks, were just all of a sudden cured of their hep C. And obviously the cost of that was, the sticker shock of $1,000 a pill, 12,000 for this course of treatment was, you know, understandably shocking. And it is tough. I think the part about cures, right, is that these are, because of the good that they do for our species and our healthcare system, they do come with a higher price. They often take a lot more money to develop, just in general, right? Think of the number of failed cures that it takes to get to the point where, oh, now we've, finally, put the key in the keyhole the right way and figured out exactly how to attack this virus or, cure this cancer, etc. So they do come with a bigger price tag and an expense associated with them. Which begs the question too, I think around the Gilead time, right, when we were both there was a lot of hubbub about, oh, the government should really step in and do something about this. What if the government just bought all of Gilead's HCV supply and gave it out for free? What if there was even something crazier where people were saying, yeah, the government should just buy Gilead outright and manage. I mean, like, that might be kind of ridiculous, just a government entity acquiring a publicly traded company. But in retrospect now, that was like several years ago. We obviously went through, the whole, the pandemic where we had an emergency situation where, the government was covering the cost of, reimbursing companies for the cost of development and covering, a lot of the cost for the, distribution of these drugs COVID drugs, such that there was no out-of-pocket cost to, the end citizen who was getting these types of things. So it's kind of, I think about that often, and this HCV example sort of, counterposed with the experience that we had with how the government is paying for certain drugs, during emergency situations. And we can argue whether HCV is an emergency or not, but the more interesting point to me is the fact that there is kind of only one entity in the United States that has the ability to, make long-term bets on a person's health and stick with that patient their whole life and, get a, quote unquote, good ROI on that investment. Like, does the government really have, I mean, for these very special cases where you get 100% cure rate, or like for polio, where if you get a polio vaccination, you get 100% prevention of, getting polio, maybe that's the right role for like a single entity to go in and just say, hey, this is we as the United States of America have the most to benefit from, preventing this illness or curing this illness, because that person is just going to be alive for the rest of their life. We're going to, they're going to be ambulatory and moving and alive and not costing the healthcare system a bunch more money. They'll be going to work, potentially paying taxes and all that type of stuff like that. The government kind of has the most to gain for it. Is there a role for them to actually, like, in these very special circumstances, I don't want to say like be a single payer, but almost function in a way where like, hey, we will make the investment on, on the behalf of our citizens, such that, over the 65, 70 some odd years that patient's life is going to continue to live, like we're going to, recoup that cost.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And while I'm not an advocate of government interference, I think it's one of those unique situations where perhaps there are some special scenarios, because we talked about how the industry and the system is not really set up for cures. Is there a certain scenario where they come in and put the government might behind it? Because one of the things we've already discussed is the cost of just liver transplant itself. If you let this disease run its course, liver transplant from the latest estimates in the United States are no less than 800,000, and then can exceed easily 1.1 million. And that doesn't necessarily take into account the full lifetime cost of being on lifetime immunosuppressive. So the governments, for example, in your hypothetical scenario, would come in, cover the curative treatment. And then what happens is that individual, that patient, no longer has to even think about liver transplant or anything else. And they continue to contribute to GDP and be effective members of society, again, in this hypothetical scenario. So I do think there are some situations where that might make sense, because what that would do is, frankly, Shivu, think about the push and pull. So the government is pulling this through the market. Do you know how much push that would generate for companies to come in and say, whoa, if I actually knock this disease out of the park so humanity never has to think about it again in 10 years, I think it could change things. There would be a lot of incentive for biotechs to take bigger swings. The problem is, as we talked about before with cures, it's very difficult to really nail down the disease. I gave you the example before of virologic versus metabolic insult. Some things continue. Virus is a little different. It's very unique in that way. But then we have technologies like gene editing, which I think was one of the other things we may want to get into. So I think it's a fascinating idea. And one other thing I'd throw in, I have long lamented how we have so many generics, and there are some diseases, especially heterogeneous diseases, where we know that there's so many validated mechanisms. There are frankly a lot of good generic drugs that are more effective in combination with other generics. But because they're generic, the industry tends not to pursue such combination treatments. I believe that's the place of the government to come in and say, look, this stuff is below pennies at this stage, but we know if these two work together for a certain patient population that exceeds 10 million, we'll just co-formulate, because the government certainly has the ability to do that. I've long felt there is a place for them to get involved because it reduces the cost of the healthcare system. I'm thinking of so many effective treatments in cardiology where we know if we reduce your risk over various parameters. Maybe it's your lipid profile, maybe it's something like hypertension and other things. Your cardiovascular outcomes are so much more improved, but that is only the place of the government. You're not going to convince the typical sponsor in the industry to come in and say, oh, I want to work in generics, because the immediate concern is reimbursement. Cardiology, for example, it's very common to have outcome studies that exceed $1 billion, $2 billion. Why would we try to fight generics where there's no reimbursement? So I do agree with you. I think it's a valid point. There is a place for the government to come in special scenarios.
And we should say too, I mean, part of that is because, private insurers for the most part don't have that long-term time horizon of, oh, I'm gonna, cover this one-time cost for this patient, and that's gonna result in X amount of, realized profit for us, right? They're all public companies. They all need to report, their quarterly earnings and show a little, uptick in their EPS growth and all that type of stuff. So that kind of infrastructure, or that setup, what the incentives aren't necessarily there. Put on top of that the fact that, like, most people don't stick with the same insurance plan for very long, right? I think the average is like a couple years, or maybe less than that, where you end up switching insurance. Once you switch job, most of the time you're switching your insurance plan as well, right? And so I do think, I'm not a single payer healthcare person. I think I'm a believer in, competition creates more value for, the end consumer. But I mean, I think you can make the argument, right, that even in the example you gave about, AbbVie and Gilead, right? AbbVie came in with, like you were saying, an 8-week version of a curative pill. Gilead had the 12-week, that caused them to go back to the drawing board and, keep bumping it up, but at the end of the day, efficacy wise, both of those were curative drugs, right? The value of like 4 weeks versus 8 weeks versus 12 weeks being 4 weeks, like, to me, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, that's like more of an incremental increase. Like, once the efficacy is, the efficacy is the more important thing, right?
Yes.
And I think for certain diseases where, we've threaded the needle so perfectly as a scientific community as to, yes, we know how to cure this thing, and the efficacy isn't going to get much better than, 99.9%, right? Maybe that's the perfect situation where, like, a government can come in and go, we're just going to cover, if you guys, get a bullseye on this, we got your back. Like, we're going to cover this for you. And I think, to your point, like, it would stimulate a lot of, it's not just going to be these, Pfizer's and Merck's and BMS's that are going after this stuff. It's going to be a lot of small companies as well, small, nimble, innovative companies with a lot of, high risk capital backing them, that are going to go and try and, shoot for this type of prize. If the outcome is very clearly set, right? The government has an interest in curing this specific disease, which is, massively deleterious to our population. Like, if you hit the bullseye on this, like, we got your back, right? And we might be coming up on, I don't know that these are the perfect cases for this, but I think this debate will pop up, right? Like, are GLP-1s this type of, bullseye for this whole swath of diseases that are related to kind of our cardiovascular and metabolic health, right? Are, other drugs going to kind of find their way into this area, right? Like, we're going to talk about Vertex in a bit, but, Vertex is, I think Vertex says, not cured cystic fibrosis, but clearly is like the market leader in that space, and added, years and years and years of life to so many patients who didn't have anything, left to take for a very, a rare and, um, very lethal disease. They're reinvesting all those profits, right, into more R&D. And I think doing it, pretty expertly, going after potentially curative therapies for type 1 diabetes, going after transformational therapies in pain, right? Think about the opioid crisis and how much that has hurt our country and other countries around the world. They have a non-opioid pain drug, one, like the first one in like forever, right? That are, in my opinion, it's probably just going to get red carpeted right to, right to approval because of the societal benefit that comes with that. And so I do think, over the course of our lifetime, I hope the powers that be and the stakeholders that be think more about this, like, where are these special cases where we've really threaded the needle so perfectly on curing a disease. And, you know, let's not lose sight of um, who needs to benefit most from that. And it's the people who have that disease. And then let's figure out the best way to pay for it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. And the other thing I'd add too is, this is more of a contentious space, but Pfizer and its COVID vaccine, we have friends in corp dev, and after Pfizer did so well with BioNTech with that vaccine that was pretty effective along with Moderna's, they had generated a lot of unexpected income in a very compressed period. It would have normally taken a much longer time. How many friends do we have in corp dev who are saying, it seems like in every major deal there's a black horse in the room, and we don't know who it is, but it just seemed like what happened with Pfizer was they had all this firepower to reinvest. So there's external M&A, but there's internal development as well. And so one of the things you and I probably align on is that smaller biotechs just don't have the reach and scale. They have significant execution risk. They don't have the reach and scale to get to every place on the planet, to reach every patient. And frankly, some of the more complicated studies like in immuno-oncology, you do need a certain machine behind it, which small biotechs don't have. And so there's been a lot of debate with Pfizer buying Seagen and what does it really mean and all that. But one thing I've learned working in IO, for example, is that when those trials get pretty complicated, you sometimes need that full force behind it. A lot of KOLs, especially up and coming KOLs, they find it easier to work with larger orgs because to them, as they build their career, they want to say, oh, if I'm working in immuno-oncology, of course I want to work with Merck. They have Keytruda. Why would I want to work with the small biotech across the street that doesn't really have that scale, reach, and gravitas? For their career, that matters too. And also it gives them instant access to so many more patients. So the bigger companies have that ability. So when they do generate that type of income and they buy a small company, it's the kind of situation where you can almost guarantee, and I'd love to do a case study on this, Shivu, maybe it's a separate conversation. Did the peak revenues change? Was the big pharma able to generate more from that drug than the small pharma expectations? And that's what I find so fascinating, because the big orgs have that reach. And when they generate this type of income, you can see it. There might be some returns to shareholders, but for the most part, shareholders are well taken care of when you stay innovative, when you invest in the pipeline, when you push for a new treatment.
Yeah, and that's maybe for the more uninitiated folks listening, that's kind of a dynamic that is more or less cemented over the last like 10 years or so, I would say, maybe longer, is that, the smaller companies in the sector, the biotech, this umbrella term of biotech, are more of are excellent shepherds of innovation, right? They have a lot of high risk capital empowering their business. They can be very focused on, one particular platform or technology or drug or disease area and prosecute that with, great speed and focus. But they don't have the commercial muscle to get that therapy, if it's successful, to everybody, even in the country, in the United States, that needs it, let alone the rest of the world. And so there's been this like shift, I think, where, biotechs are very good shepherds of innovation, and the biggest companies in our space are very good, I always say, very good scalers of innovation, right? And that's where that dynamic comes in, where, hey, you get this drug to a certain point, and, there's these big gorillas in our sector that are just well-oiled machines that going, yes, we're going to just plug this into our commercial infrastructure, and we have, sites in all these different countries, and we just know how to make sure that we get this to everybody that needs it.
Yeah, Shivu, let me actually share one example for folks that I think may be helpful and is real life and is something that others can look up actually. So Horizon Pharma, which is more of a specialty pharma, they're not technically biotech. They're based in Chicago. They had developed a treatment for a disease called thyroid eye disease. Sometimes it's called Graves' ophthalmology. And what was interesting was in the United States, that is viewed as a rare disease. In Europe, the EMA, which is their FDA, they did not believe it's rare disease. And so that has immediate pricing implications. And Horizon, being a smaller specialty pharma company, they decided to just not even evaluate any cross-Atlantic effort. They decided to just say, we're not going to develop in Europe. So that worked well for a while because they were the only approved on-target treatment for this disease that actually resolved the disease. You could say it's close to curative. It's not quite, but because of just the general hormonal process of the disease and the cascading pathophysiology, it can return. But for the most part, it resolved these symptoms of these patients. And so Horizon walked away from Europe and rest of the world. They had some interest in Japan. What happened was they got bought out by Amgen. Amgen immediately came in and said, no, this is a worldwide drug. We're going to develop it in Europe. We're going to develop it in the Middle East. We're going to go for South America. And so that is a tangible and realistic example of a company that was smaller and had significantly fewer resources. And then when a big company comes in, they say, no, this is going to go global. And here's how we're going to maximize it to make sure we reach as many patients as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too, maybe backtracking a little bit. Yeah, most of the time these cures are very lucrative for companies, but I do think there's this pressure that comes with curing a disease right afterward. Like you have this big pile of money. And most of the time, these companies aren't sitting there and going, yeah, we're just going to like pay our executives more because, we have this big bolus of capital and we're going to do like a ton of share buybacks, although, they do some of those. But a lot of times, like the pressure from the investment community is, who are you going to buy? Like, what are you going to do with all that money? Huh? Like, what new therapeutic areas are you going to get into? You've been a COVID company your whole life. Like, what are you guys going to do with that? Are you going to get into oncology? Are you going to do bispecifics? What are you going to do? Right. So there is this, there is somewhat, I facetiously call it a curse, but so many companies have like succumbed to that. Right. And, Gilead got this big bolus of capital from HCV and HIV. What did they, reinvested in? Like we did dozens and dozens of different oncology deals, some really big ones, because that was targeted as an area where like, yeah, we need to, make an impact in oncology. And same thing for inflammation and, some of these other disease areas, right? Vertex, for example, we talked about, what types of other, genetically driven diseases that they wanted to get into, as well as pain, right? But companies do kind of fall victim to that. And I think there's like the two examples of, COVID was kind of a great example of this, right? BioNTech and Moderna both made a lot of money from selling vaccines. And now you're starting to see, the cash flow from those sales is starting to trickle off, right? It's getting less and less and less. And there's pressure. Then there had been pressure from investment community to go, okay, Moderna, what are you doing with all this, COVID money that you got? You were right place, right time with this COVID vaccine. What are you going to do next, right? Are you going to go into oncology? Are you going to do something else? And you kind of see them using more of this like platform approach. They seem to be more like be investing in themselves and their platform and trying to spread that across pretty much kind of disease agnostic areas. That if you look at their pipeline, they're kind of in everything, right? They're in rare disease and, other prophylactic vaccines for other viruses and, therapeutic vaccines and all this other type of stuff versus, BioNTech, which, has been very anchored in oncology, right? They took most of that money and you see them start to like redeploy it mostly in partnerships and acquisitions with Chinese companies. But, they got into PD-1 VEGF, they got into, a novel CTLA-4, they're, invested in cell therapy, but it's all guided at kind of, building out an oncology company. And so, there's not one right way to do it, but there is that other side of the coin, which is and I think both of those companies are really good examples of like younger companies that reinvested, that capital into hopefully, developing new therapies that are maybe not equally as potent as a cure, but, meaningful advancements in the treatment paradigm for a number of diseases.
I think it's a good point. And one other thing that I think is relevant, and it's a very good example, just specifically to BioNTech, using those vaccine revenues to build out their pipeline. The space that you mentioned, Shivu, I think it's worth noting to folks who may not be as plugged in. The space they decided to get into with immuno-oncology is essentially the next generation for Keytruda. And for those who are not aware, that's one of the best-selling drugs of all time. Forget about the selling aspect. Think of how many lives that drug has saved. And so there is some thinking that this particular target, it's a bispecific antibody. Theirs is a little different than some of the others, but for the most part, bispecific antibody, there's some thinking that this could be even better So what you have is, instead of a monopolistic view on Merck coming in and doing the next gen, I'm going to find the next Keytruda 2.0, which is essentially what they're trying to do with the company they entered in this space. You have other companies saying, oh, we think this nuanced approach could be efficacious and advantageous. So the diversity of innovation is also important. If one org or one large cap company runs it, it's going to be very different than the risk tolerant small biotechs who are saying, oh, we're going to swing for it. We're going to swing for the fences. We want to try to get to something that's close to curative and let these people live a normal life. I think that's what's very special as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we discussed a lot here. We discussed I think we touched on how hard it is for cures to get developed, just given, the complexity of medicines that are coming out now, right? Gene editing is very complicated. Cell therapy is very complicated. There's this history of failures, even for small molecules, right? That have been trying to prosecute a particular disease that, eventually you kind of reach this tipping point and there's this escape velocity that gets you to, unlocking this specific disease. I think we touched on some of the systemic barriers as well, the differences in our insurance system, and, maybe there's these special places where a single entity can kind of cover a lot of the costs. I think one part we didn't discuss yet, what I'm curious for your thoughts are, some of this seems like a communication issue, right? Like there's a feeling that we touched on at the beginning of this about, we can't trust these drug companies, we can't trust insurance companies, etc. So let's not speak for the insurance industry, but at least from our perspective, like being drug developers, from our facet of the community, what can we do to better communicate like this commitment to curing a disease?
I think this is a really interesting point because it's not well understood. What does the average person know? Let's go back to an example that we've discussed already so it's easier to kind of flow with the logic. Gilead's HCV cures. What does the audience really know? If you're not suffering or you don't have a loved one who suffers from HCV, you're not going to be aware of the impact. And all you're going to see is those commercials and you're going to tune out because it's not for you. And frankly, those commercials may not be relevant for many of the people. So how does the industry communicate? I think that's one of the biggest challenges. I feel like there should be another wave of interaction with the community to show this is what we're trying to do and this is what it means. And it's going to take time. It's going to take education. But one thing you stated before, I think is important. I think it's good people ask these questions. I think it's good for people to be skeptical. But what you have to follow up with your skepticism is a healthy dose of effort to make sure your understanding, your skepticism is properly allocated. And now what we've tried to do is highlight how curative treatments are not something that can be gamed. There's too many competitive pressures. There's all these other things in research and science that, frankly, we're still trying to figure out. So what that tells me is, Shivu, what we're dealing with is a lack of expressive force from the industry to explain what it means to do what we're trying to do. And so I do think there is a hole there. And I feel if companies explain, here's what we're trying to do, we don't know if it'll work. We don't even have this approved yet, but this is the approach. And I think you have to be careful because when a drug isn't approved, you can only communicate so much with the world. You can't make claims. But let's say you're a company and you already have a certain amount of drugs approved in a space. You're known for that. Like you said, for example, Vertex and cystic fibrosis. What they're trying to do is now with gene editing and trying to get into curative therapies, they've made a commitment that we're pushing this as far as we can. We think this is the next wave. And so I think if the industry helped explain that approach and the limits of why maybe we're not a cure yet, and maybe we won't be there for a while, and maybe these are the barriers to getting there, maybe that could be interesting as well, Shivu, because again, you may have that research student who joins that seminar and says, well, that's interesting. Maybe I'm going to do my dissertation on that because I want to see if I can push that forward. If they can't do it, no problem. I understand. But maybe there's something there they're not considering. So I feel like that's almost like an R&D patient engagement to express where we are. And also the truth is these curative therapies, even though we highlighted the systemic barriers, they are absolutely aligned with public health goals. What is our goal? Is to live well and live long. This is, of course, where curative treatments belong.
Absolutely. I think too, for the average person, science is really complicated, right? And I think a lot of times our messaging in the biotech pharma community can be anchored so closely to science, and even like the people, the surrogates that are, championing some of these cures are often people who come from, they're an MD who helped with the trials, or they're, like an academic elite type person. And I think, employing uh like connection with people who are more everyday and feeling the impact of, what this new drug or new therapy did to change their life, and anchoring like the benefit of a cure to like a human story, I think is more connected, right? Psychologically, we're all, very social species. We're social species, and, we put ourselves in other people's shoes. I mean, it's the whole reason why, like, you see like a very emotional movie and you start to cry, right? Like you see yourself, you feel that person's pain and suffering and the happiness that they have coming out the other side. I think doing more with, like, once we do have a cure, like anchoring it in real human experience, I think is really important. We do that a decent amount in the oncology world, right? Especially with like, like for, if you go to Heights website, they have a ton of stories about how, this drug cured this, Yescarta cured this man who had lymphoma, and now he, can go on hikes again with his family, and he was able to make it to his, daughter's wedding and all this type of stuff, right? I think like as an industry, sometimes we, don't think enough about that. Like this is anchored in like human emotion as well. And like, your choice, especially now more than ever, about like what to put in your body. Am I going to take this drug or that drug? It's still like, it's a decision that should be made in concert with your doctor, and you're in, a comprehensive set of research about what's right for you, and a conversation with your doctor about that. But it is an emotional decision too. Like every decision is emotional, right? You know, as much as we like to see like behavioral economics, papers that talk about, oh, humans are rational. We're not, we're very irrational in our nature. And part of that is because we, you know, weave a lot of emotion in our decision making. And I think anchoring, some of the emotional elements in reality for what these cures can mean for people, I think might bring a lot more clarity to the whole cures discussion.
Yeah, I think the tangible impact, I think, is sometimes not as easy to see. And so when I mentioned one of the other disease areas that we talked about, for example, Horizon, I mentioned that company. What I didn't mention is thyroid eye disease can be so awful, it can risk your vision. And if you let that disease run its course without any intervention, you're heading towards, frankly, being blind, and you may need to get a surgery to try to save your vision in the last minute. It's called orbital decompression surgery. But what Horizon came in with was actually a treatment that stops that whole process. And so now there are thousands of patients who don't even think about thyroid eye disease anymore. And their favorable view of that drug, that medicine, that company, and the FDA who supported the approval of that drug is so strong. You have essentially a legion of supporters. And that's what medicines can do. And so people who wouldn't even leave their home because it visually affects your face, and they would wear sunglasses or go out and do their grocery shopping or chores at night, you have them living a normal life. They don't have to think about how long am I going to be able to see. That is not something that is captured well. You'll get the anecdotes and maybe a Facebook, group page where they're trying to help others, but you're really not going to get to scale the true impact of what that medicine and what it can do.
Absolutely. So anything more there? Should we touch on kind of the last piece about how the healthcare system can better adapt to cures?
Yeah, I think that would be a good flow to get into that now.
Yeah. So, I mean, we touched on some of this. Like, I think there's obviously different payment models that might be better used in the case of a cure, especially something like the HCV cures, where we're like near 100% cure rate for some types of things. But, maybe we could touch on other adaptations to our healthcare system that align ourselves better with cures. And one piece that I did want to touch on was more about like how I think companies too, right? Like there's this negative perception of us that, oh, we just want to keep people sick because we want to make money. And part of that too is part of the reason why people are sick, right? Is some of our lifestyle and some of the economic incentives that we have, right? It's, you know, especially for cardiovascular and metabolic diseases, and, you know, probably beyond that as we're learning with, you know, some of this GLP-1 data coming out. A lot of that disease is lifestyle driven, and a lot of it is a function of the trade-offs like the average American has to make, right? It's cheaper to buy fast food than it is to, you know, go get real produce at a grocery store and cook at home, right? People might not even have time to, like, you know, go home and cook and feed their family. It's just easier to eat something ultra processed and cheaper oftentimes, right? You know, there's so many like toxins in our environment that are, you know, most likely driving certain diseases, right? The stat I always bring up is that in the oncology world, right? I think we did a full court press, especially in California, on, you know, smoking is bad for you and smoking causes all these types of cancers. I mean, there's a new chapter to that with like vaping and all this stuff that's happening with kids that maybe we should talk about in a future episode. But um, you know, I think we've done a good job from a public health perspective of like curtailing the amount of smoking, and that in turn has, I, if I'm remembering the statistics correctly, like done a really good job reducing the rates of cancers that are driven by smoking. But, you know, and the one cancer people think of when in smoking, right, is lung cancer. Like, oh, you know, lung cancer should be going down if smoking has gone up or gone down as well, right? And it has for certain lung cancers, but lung cancer at large is like still going up, right? So what does that tell you? There's some other stuff, you know, either in our environment or our lifestyle that is probably, you know, not helping, if not causing, you know, probably not helping the incidence of those types of diseases. And so I think there's more obviously from like a policy perspective and lifestyle choices perspective we could be doing, but where companies fall in, I think, is more support for that type of stuff, right? You know, you be directly support things that are, you know, preventative medicine and pro health, right? Directly prevent things that, you know, you can't create a market around, right? I think that, you know, obviously there's always going to be some people who feel like, oh, you know, that's just, you know, like virtue signaling and all this type of stuff. But I don't think that's everybody, right? I think we as an industry can do a better job, like supporting, um, you know, more of these lifestyle interventions and, you know, other changes that would theoretically, like, you know, shrink a market that a drug company would need to build a therapy against.
Yeah, I think when we're getting into cures, and this goes back to the metabolic comments you and I have made, it's true. There are some things that cannot be curative because of the lifestyle that we have. So if you're exposing yourself to a bunch of carcinogens, there's nothing that a medicine can cure over time that'll eventually create cells that mutate uncontrollably and grow uncontrollably if you're constantly exposing yourself to that. So by reducing smoking, for example, that had huge benefits. I was working actually on a project for a big pharma company to get their smoking cessation drug covered by Medicare. And the reason why it wasn't covered yet, this is probably about a decade ago, was because the government said, we don't really know if there's value in stopping smoking when you're 65, 75, or 85, because the literature stops. It's more about, oh, when you're 20 and 40 and 50, smoking obviously reduces your life. Well, we did the modeling around that, and we found that even at 85, if you stop smoking, you get to continue to live longer. And so it shows the power of lifestyle modification when you have a serious detrimental habit that's ongoing. And it's the same thing. You mentioned GLP-1s. You know, I think in this week, we heard for the first time obesity rates have started to tick down, or perhaps they're plateauing. Now, there is some thinking that could be because of GLP-1s, but the GLP-1s are really not in the rural parts of the country. They're still in the larger cities. So there's potentially a sign there or signal. But what I think happens here is not just on the patients and individuals' lifestyle and the choices that they make, but also our physicians, because in school, they're trained to learn and forced to learn and memorize so many facts so quickly that if in that snapshot of time of their education, the disease isn't cured, what happens is they just go and say, okay, I'm going to manage symptoms. I'm going to make sure it doesn't get worse. That is the foundation of their thinking. And a lot of people say that is the Western way. To some extent, that's true because we don't have insight into some of the curative processes. We don't know them yet. And so you have doctors who go in, they're in their late 20s, early 30s, and then they start practicing medicine for 20 years. And it's very common where if they're not tethered to the latest developments, they may not even know. And so that's why there is a lag, there is a knowledge inertia in the system where as things evolve, they may not know the latest. I remember speaking to a loved one. This is very common in elderly. You have osteoporosis, and they didn't even know about one of the best drugs in the space. This is in a very small town in the Midwest, and that drug was approved in 2013. And I just thought, how could you not know about something that's 11 years old? But I'm not saying it doesn't cure osteoporosis, but people live longer on it, and it can reverse the awful progression of that disease in just a few years if you stay on it and are religious with your lifestyle modifications. And so what it told me was that even though that drug isn't even that expensive when you're on insurance, especially for Medicare, there's just a lack of awareness on things that are not curative, Shivu. So getting into things that are curative, which is the cutting edge. Curing is it. After that, there's nothing else you need to do with the disease. That is the leading edge of knowledge. It's very hard for them to know that if they can't even know the basic thing, that there's a new treatment for something that's so helpful, but isn't curative and makes an impact. So I think that's a part of it as well. How can we expect physicians, to know all these fine details when everything changes every day? You could have one major healthcare conference. Let's use an easy and big one, ASCO, which tends to be in summertime. It's the biggest healthcare conference for medical conference. There's so many new developments that come out every year from that conference and from others. How are you supposed to stay abreast of it? And by the way, many of those new developments may not yet be approved, so you have to wait. Then you have to stay in front of that. There's so many issues with trying to understand the latest. And so I think that is something that can fall, Shivu, to the industry to make people aware this is where things are headed. And so I think that's one of the challenges. And, I think having innovative insurance plans, we didn't talk about that in detail yet, but we mentioned in the HCV section, there are innovative methods to cover drugs, maybe subscription models or things like that. I feel like that is the onus and responsibility of the reimbursement entities in this country, because what happens is you have people who won't pursue it. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of how I think about this. There are things that can be adjusted in the system to help adjust. And frankly, everything you and I talked about is a surround sound approach. There is not a single bullet that will take care of all this.
Yeah. Fixing healthcare, there's not one specific thing that's going to untangle all of this, right? It is going to be iterative. And it's going to take every entity within the healthcare system to change some aspect about themselves in order to better align this to, patients getting the therapies that they need and improving our overall human health. I think too, I speak on this from like more of a novice's perspective, but the reason why like this prize model for a cure is really interesting, right, is because the government is the one entity that can, take a 70-year bet on a person's life. And, people switch private insurers all the time. But, today's day and era of like our ability and our compute power and, our ability to like access AI models and things like that, this should be solvable of like, how do you kind of adjust payments on the back end between insurers such that even if you do like switch insurers, maybe Blue Cross has to send a little check to Aetna because they covered some curative therapy when Kenny was, a patient under their care 2 years ago. I mean, like that seems like a very like solvable problem that some sort of decentralized system could just very easily manage. And I don't know, but to your point, like there needs to be incentive for some of these entities to actually change. And that comes from competition, right? Mostly that's the most direct force of forcing, especially very stagnant, stale industries that haven't changed in a long time to forcibly change is when something disruptive and innovative comes about. And we need more of that. I mean, I think we're a little spoiled in some respects because we see that all the time in drug development. There's always somebody trying to hit a home run in a particular disease area. It doesn't always work, right? It's a 1% outcome. But when it does, it completely shifts the way that we think about a particular space. And we haven't seen as much of that transformational innovation in some of the other aspects of the healthcare system. And I hope somebody's working on that. I mean, again, I'm a novice at that type of stuff, but it seems like something that is more attainable and reachable now than it was 5 years ago when we didn't have the mathematical and computing power that we do currently. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think maybe Shivu might be helpful to kind of just summarize
Yeah.
everything that we
Go for it.
discussed. So I'd say long story short, and tell me if I missed anything. When there's skepticism, again, skepticism's healthy. Let's all be skeptical about what's going on because that's how you stay informed and get the best care for yourself. Skepticism around, oh, the industry is gaming curative treatments and they don't want to cure us, they want to treat us. We've looked into this. Is this true? Well, just if you look at the development of drugs, how you must share your data, how you must evangelize your data and show everyone. The idea that you are the only owner of that insight and that you are going to control the cure versus chronic process of that drug and treatment regimen doesn't really align with what we see when you have medical conferences, when you have the FDA involved, when you must disclose all the data for the patients who took that drug. And then, by the way, after the drug's approved, you get what's called, we didn't talk about that as much, but RWD, real world data on that medicine. And then researchers look to see, can we make it better? So there is not any way to think about gaming cures. If the industry can do it, the industry will do it. It is unfortunate that many treatments are in the chronic paradigm, and that is an unfortunate reality of just the limited knowledge we have in that particular area for the scientific innovation. But as innovation progresses, as you've seen, we mentioned cystic fibrosis, we mentioned HCV, things do progressively get better. We mentioned Keytruda, and there's this next generation now of people pursuing this novel treatment approach that could be so much more better. That is the approach. Eventually, if you look at it, cures do happen. We've talked about vaccines and HCV, and that just takes time. The industry really doesn't have any interest in gaming because they're going to move on to the next disease and the next.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And competition is key again. I mean, I think we need a healthy biotech sector because that's where the competitive innovation leans towards coming from, right? And the more competitive science that we have, the more critical we are of the science that comes out of these companies, the better we're all for it. So 100% agree with you on that. Anything else we want to add before we close? Hopefully people found this insightful. I mean, I think another big theme of this was education, and hopefully this was educative for the people listening. I think, it is very important to be critical and do your own research and inform yourself and come to your own opinion and think for yourself. And hopefully this discussion about cures, how our sector pursues cures, what the upstream and downstream implications of them are, kind of additive to you forming your own opinion.
Yeah, nothing else I'd add. Maybe the one theme that I think comes out of this episode, and Shu, I think is a teaser for future episodes, is the industry needs to remain connected to the patient. By remaining connected to the patient, a lot of these things naturally get better, and the patient and society will understand what the industry is actually trying to do, as long as that connection stays strong. It's when you get distant that you get frustration and a lack of understanding, and the skepticism grows without the appropriate effort to make sure that skepticism is appropriately placed.
Awesome. I think that's a good place to end. So it's Kenny and Shivu signing off for Drug Dealing. We'll catch you next time in the next episode, and hope you enjoy this one. Stay tuned for more.
Thank you, everybody.